All right, welcome everybody. This is Park Seeds Getting Your Garden Ready for Fall webinar. We're excited to have you join us today. We're excited to present this content to you today from our good friend Shelby DeVore. Just some rules and notes. Prior to joining this webinar, you might have submitted some questions, and we're going to try to address some of those questions at the end of this presentation. If you do have any questions coming out of this presentation that you want to address, please feel free to email us at info@parkseed.com. I'll reiterate it at the end, so in case you didn't get it, but the email address is info@parkseed.com. I just want to introduce our friend, Shelby DeVore. Shelby is a seasoned gardener with nearly 2 decades of experience gardening. Her personal experience gardening includes a master's in science in agriculture, teaching high school and college agriculture, and forming a unique perspective on gardening. She's been able to reach and help educate thousands of gardeners on her homesteading site, farminance.com. And Shelby's been able to grow in a wide variety of conditions, from apartment patios to commercial greenhouses, hydroponic systems, and everything in between. So we're super excited to have Shelby with us. And Shelby, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eric. I'm super excited to be here with you guys today, and let's get our gardens ready for fall. First of all, I want to talk to you a little bit about how to handle some late summer heat, because if you're anything like me, your garden is probably still going and you're trying to, squeeze out the last little bit of summer that you can. And there's a few things that you can do to keep your garden growing a little bit longer and kind of stretch that growing season into the fall. So some of my favorite things to do regarding the late summer heat, we're going to talk about soil moisture and why that's important. We're going to talk about mulching, weeds, shade, and then I know this sounds silly, but we're also going to talk about the weather a little bit. And after we wrap up how to handle this late summer heat, we're going to talk about how you can start getting your garden ready to transition to that cooler gardening season. So I'm sure that you guys know soil moisture is critical in your garden, right? A lot of places around the country tend to go through a little bit of a late summer drought. You might get some showers, hit or miss, but for the most part, late summer tends to be a drier season in July and August for a lot of the United States. So we really want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on that soil moisture content. So if you're not watering your garden consistently, like maybe at the beginning of the growing season, your soil was pretty moist and you didn't really have to water your garden, and you kind of got into the groove of not watering your garden, you might be starting to see some of those effects now. Anytime that your plant goes through a period of low soil moisture, it starts to think, what can I do to extend my life cycle? And a lot of times what it does is it'll stop producing fruits. So your tomatoes, your bell peppers, cucumbers, what have you. And that's not what we want, right? In our vegetable garden. We definitely want our plants to produce as long as possible. So keeping soil moisture consistent is key for that. How many of you have grown tomatoes and you go out to pick tomatoes and you notice that they have these weird kind of grayish, brownish, almost look like cracks with scar tissue in them? That is directly related to soil moisture content. And what happens is during time periods like now, where you probably don't have consistent rainfall, and maybe you're not watering your garden consistently, when you do water your plants or you do get that afternoon shower, it's going to cause your tomatoes to swell. They're going to take in a lot of that extra water that they didn't have before, and they're going to swell up. And that's great, but they're going to swell so fast that the skin doesn't have time to actually grow with them. It's going to split, and that's what causes that crack in the tomato. Now, there's nothing wrong with those. That's definitely safe to eat. They just don't look all that great, right? So if you can avoid stuff like that, it's better, right? So definitely keep an eye on your soil moisture content. You want your soil to be consistently moist. This has a huge effect on how your plant can take in nutrients. Now, we all know that plants take nutrients in through the soil, right? But the root system actually has to have water in the soil to take those nutrients up. So you could have really, really rich soil, but if it doesn't have enough water in there, that plant is not going to be able to take in those nutrients. So that's another reason that soil moisture content is critical. We really want to make sure that we are keeping our soil moist, even though we're not probably getting a lot of help from Mother Nature right now. So that leads us into watering. Since we are going to be probably doing a lot of watering the garden ourselves, we want to make sure that we're doing this in a way that is not going to harm our plants. We want to water our plants properly. One of the biggest problems that I see with gardeners and their plants in the late summer are fungal diseases, things like blight and powdery mildew, maybe black spot. A lot of those can be prevented with proper watering to a certain extent. If you're watering your plants overhead, like let's say you just turn on a sprinkler and turn it loose in the garden, that is a really good way to invite fungal diseases into your garden. So your plants don't have a really effective way of drying themselves off other than sitting out in the sun and evaporation doing its thing. If you're watering early in the morning, you can get away with some overhead watering because your plant will have time to dry throughout the day. In the evening, though, definitely make sure that you are watering at the ground. That's the safest way to get water directly where the plants need it. You may think that, for example, your tomato plants, you may think that watering them overhead cools them off. Like some of your cool season crops, like you can do that with lettuce, right? To prevent it from bolting in the fall or in the spring once it starts to warm up. But tomato plants and your summer crops work a little bit differently. So make sure that you're watering them at the ground. A soaker hose is a really efficient way. If you kind of want to just put a timer on and let it do its thing and walk away, I definitely recommend a soaker hose. And we talked about the effects that soil moisture content can have on your fruits, like with the cat-faced tomatoes, which is what you call the tomatoes that have split. Again, this is safe to consume. It just doesn't look all that pretty. Now, if you've got low soil moisture to the point where your plant is really thinking that it's experiencing a drought, it's going to start dropping fruit and it's going to start dropping blooms. And if you don't get that fixed pretty soon, that plant is just going to die back. So make sure if you see signs of wilting, definitely get your plants watered. Keep an eye on that soil moisture concentration. So let's talk a little bit about mulching. When you hear the word mulching, you probably think to something like what you see in this picture, you know, the black colored wood chip mulch that you would put in a flower bed. But really, mulch can be so much more than just aesthetically pleasing in a landscape. Mulch acts like a really good insulator. So in the summer, it can help keep the ground cool. In the winter, it can help keep the ground warm. So you can definitely use this to your advantage in the vegetable garden as well. If you're trying to deal with extremely hot temperatures and keep your vegetable garden just a little bit cooler, a thick layer of mulch will help tremendously. Um, you have to think about the fact that the plant is not just the part that you see above the ground, right? We've got a complex root system that is under the ground also. So if you can keep that root system cool, it's going to help to keep the rest of the plant, the part that is above ground, cool also, and that's going to help extend your growing season. It also helps with that soil moisture content that we were just talking about. So if you're trying to watch how much water you put into your garden, maybe you're actually going through a legitimate drought in your area, and you're trying to, monitor how much water you're using, mulch can help you get the most out of the water that you actually put into your garden. So a lot of moisture is lost from the soil just through evaporation. And it's kind of like just wasted water, right? You put all this water into your garden thinking that your plants are going to get it, but really a lot of it just evaporates. So if you have a nice thick layer of mulch put down, it's going to cut back tremendously on the amount of water that actually evaporates. And it's going to make sure that your plants have enough water. It's going to help kind of hold that water in the soil instead of just letting it loose into the air. And I get asked a lot, okay, so I know mulch is good for my garden, but what is the best type of mulch? And I think that really just depends on you and your particular garden. I wouldn't recommend using wood chips for the most part, because a lot of times they'll have dyes in them, like the black or the red mulch tends to have dyes in it. And that can have some kind of wonky effects on different vegetable plants. So I wouldn't recommend wood chip mulch, but you could do like straw or kind of grass clippings. I've seen people use leaf mold. Really anything that you can layer that's pretty thick around your plants. That's really going to help insulate that soil, keep it cooler in extreme temperatures, and keep some of that water in the soil where you want it to be. Now, I do want to make one note really quick. If you are going to use straw or grass clippings for your mulch, do not use like what you see in the picture where there are seed heads on that, because that could potentially turn into a major weed problem that you don't want to fight. So make sure that you're using straw or grass clippings that do not have seed heads in them. And then you can just pile that really thick. You can go around each individual plant like what you see in the picture, and make like a nice thick ring around them, or you can just cover your entire surface of your garden bed with mulch. So let's talk about weeds. We all know and dread the fact that we have to pull weeds out of our garden, right? In the end of summer, your plants are under a lot of stress. They're producing a lot of fruit, which puts a lot of stress on them anyways. They're probably dealing with some of those drought conditions that we talked about. The soil moisture may not be consistent. All of that stuff is going to put stress on your plants, and you don't need weeds in your garden, because that is unnecessary competition that your plants just cannot compete with right now. Early on in the growing season, your plants can hang a little bit better because they're not producing, a mass amount of vegetables yet. So they're really in like the growth phase, and they can hang a little bit better if there are some weeds in the garden. But now is not the time to have weeds in your garden. So if you see weeds, get in there, pull them out. You don't want them using the water or the nutrients that are in the soil. You want your plants to get all of the help that they can potentially get right now. So get out there, pull those weeds up. Now, some of you may be dealing with extreme temperatures that are affecting how well your plants grow. A lot of your summer vegetables tend to grow best when the daytime temperatures creep up to like the low to mid 90s. Some of your vegetable plants are going to start dropping fruit or blooms when temperatures get close to 100 or over 100 degrees. Some of your plants might die back. And you can actually give them a little bit of help by providing them shade. Now, you probably remember that, or you've heard someone say at some point that, you know, if you get under the shade in the summer, it's like 20 degrees cooler, right? The same thing goes for your plants. So there are two main ways that you can really give them shade. You can provide them an overhead cover, like what you see in the picture. So you can buy like a shade tunnel, or you can definitely DIY your own and use like some screen mesh, or maybe a white or light colored bed sheet, something that's going to reflect the sunlight instead of absorb it. And you can create some type of overhead shade for your plants. And I really recommend overhead shade if you're having issues with high temperatures. So if you've got days where the temperature is consistently over 100 degrees in the middle of the day, I would definitely recommend trying to get some overhead cover on top of your plants. That's going to help kind of trick them into thinking that it's earlier in the season and not getting close to the end of summer. Another option is something that's called a shade screen. And this is something that you can hang that is vertical. And you can put it up either on the east or the west side of your plants to provide either morning or afternoon shade. If you're going to go for this route, I would recommend putting it on the west side of your garden so that you're giving your plants afternoon shade. A lot of your summer vegetable plants prefer to have a lot of morning sunlight. So you definitely don't want to take that from them, but you can take some of the direct sunlight away in the afternoon by providing them that shade screen on the west side. And I know this sounds silly, but definitely keep an eye on the weather. Okay, so when we talk about this, I mean your local weather, not what's going on nationally, because that doesn't really affect you and it doesn't really affect your plants. But keep an eye on your local weather. And what you want to watch for is really extreme temperatures or the chance for rain. So the chance for rain is always a good thing this time of year. So if you see rain, make sure, or there's a chance for rain in your forecast, make sure that you are allowing your plants access to that. So if you had shade covers or row covers or something up, you may want to take those down so you can take advantage of the potential for rain. Now, definitely keep an eye out for extreme temperatures. Maybe you live in an area where the summertime temperatures are not extreme, but you may have a few days of extreme temperatures, and you definitely want to protect your plants from that. So if you have plants that are used to growing, say, in maybe the upper 80s, if you live up north, and you have a few days of a heat wave where the temperatures get in the upper 90s, that can shock your plants and cause them to drop fruit. So if something like that's going to happen, make sure that you put up some kind of shade for your plants just to help prevent that shock. And once the threat of the heat wave has passed, you can definitely take that down and let them keep growing like normal. Okay, so now that we've talked about how to stretch and kind of extend your summer growing season, let's start talking about how you can actually get your garden ready for this fall. And I've had people ask me countless times, do I need a fall garden? And my short answer to this is always yes, yes, definitely yes. And there's a reason for that. How many of you garden all summer long? It's like your favorite kind of getaway time. You get out in the garden and you relax. And even if it's just 20 minutes, right? Or 5 minutes. And then at the end of the growing season, after you've pulled up your summer garden, you kind of go through like a little, slump period, right? Like it's not fun when you have to pull up your garden. I don't know about you, but I'm always thinking like, I have all this free time now. What am I supposed to do with it? So a fall garden will definitely give you more time in the garden, which can be wonderful for your emotional health, right? Like, let's not go through the fall slump. Let's keep our garden going. Not only that, but there is nothing quite as good as food that you've grown yourself, right? Like, I'm sure you've heard someone say, and I say this all the time, there's nothing that tastes as good as a homegrown tomato. And really, that holds true for pretty much anything that you could grow in the garden. So you can definitely put fresh homegrown vegetables on your plate for a longer period of time if you're gardening through the fall. Now, let's talk about the benefits for your actual garden, because a fall garden is not going to just benefit you or your dinner table, but it's also going to benefit your garden itself. So we're going to talk about that. Some of the organisms that live in the soil are beneficial to your plants. They actually have symbiotic relationships with your plants, and they depend on the plants to be there, and your plants depend on them to be there also. So these soil organisms kind of go through a dead period if you're not growing stuff in your garden in the fall, right? If there's no plants growing there, there's no plants for them to have a symbiotic relationship with. And so those beneficial organisms can actually die back, which is not good for the plants that you put in there later. The nutrients in your soil can also be altered if you have a fall garden. And when I say that, I don't want you to think that that's a bad thing. That's actually a really good thing. And it can also prevent some of the negative effects of not gardening in the fall. For example, if you're not growing anything where your summer garden was, and you've pulled up all your plants from your summer garden, now you're just left with a bare patch of soil. That soil is going to wash away. It's going to erode over the winter time. The nutrients that were in it are going to wash away. They're going to leach out, and they're just lost. So a fall garden can actually help hold those in place. So let's go into a little bit more depth on the last three things. So soil organisms that are beneficial, there are really two that come to mind right off the top of my head. One of those is mycorrhiza, which is a fungi that has a beneficial or symbiotic relationship with a lot of vegetable plants. And what the mycorrhiza actually does is kind of acts like an extension to your plant's root system, okay? We all know that plants take in nutrients through the roots from the soil, right? But they can't reach everything. And the mycorrhiza actually kind of acts like a in-between guy. So the plant will give the mycorrhiza energy, and in exchange, the mycorrhiza is going to absorb things like potassium or nitrogen and pass it on to the root system of the plant. So this is definitely something that you want in the soil, right? But it's also something that tends to be lost when you don't have anything growing in your garden. So you definitely want to have something there, even if it's not something that you actively wanted to use. Like if you want to just plant a cover crop just so that there's something there to help keep those soil organisms happy and healthy and in your soil. And then another soil organism that comes to mind is the nitrogen fixing bacteria that lives in your soil. So one of the key nutrients that all plants need to grow and thrive is nitrogen. But there are actually many different forms of nitrogen. So we have ammonias and nitrates and nitrites, and not all of these are created equally. So if you don't have the right form of nitrogen in your soil, your plant is not going to be able to use it. So you could put all of the nitrogen in the world into your garden soil, but if it's not the right kind, your plants can't use it. So there are specialized types of bacteria that exist naturally in the soil that are called nitrogen fixing bacteria. And they'll actually turn unusable forms of nitrogen into a usable form. Okay, so that is definitely something that you want in your soil, right? Because they're essentially taking this nitrogen that can't be used by your plants and turning it pretty much into free fertilizer, right? Free food for your plants. So you definitely want organisms like the nitrogen fixing bacteria and the mycorrhiza to be able to hang out and thrive in your garden soil, because that's just going to make your next garden even healthier. And if you go about this the right way and you do crop rotation, and you're careful about the types of plants that you put in your garden, you can add nutrients back to your soil from those plants as well. For example, beans and peas are types of legumes, and legumes are really good at taking unusable nitrogen and breaking it down into forms of usable nitrogen. So they do a very similar thing that the nitrogen fixing bacteria do. So you could definitely plant something like a legume in your garden in the fall to try to put some of that usable nitrogen back into the soil. Okay, so how do you actually plan a fall garden? Right, planning a summer garden seems easy because the garden centers are packed with plants and you can find seeds everywhere, and pretty much once it starts getting warm outside, you can plant, right? Planning a fall garden it seems a little bit more intimidating, but it really should not be. It's really very simple. So basically, to start a fall garden, you have two options. Number one, you can do it all at once. So you can go in, and when your summer garden has stopped producing, or it's starting to slack off and you're just really not getting that much out of it anymore, you can go in and you can pull up all of your summer plants. Once you've pulled up your summer plants, you can go in and plant all of your fall stuff. So you can kind of do it all at once like that. Or you can do it gradually and kind of mimic succession planting. So succession planting is planting something a little at a time so that you get a gradual harvest. Now, with a fall garden, if you want to incorporate that into your garden gradually, what you could do is go in and let's say your cucumber plants have died back and they're not producing anymore, but your tomatoes and your peppers and your okra still are. You could go in and pull up your cucumber plants, leave the rest of it, and go ahead and start putting some of your fall plants in the space where your cucumber plants were. So which method is actually the best? Well, that really depends on your particular garden and your goals for your garden. You also need to consider what you want to plant, right? So a lot of your fall crops are cool season crops and they have a short growing period, which means it's not going to take them long to be ready to harvest. For example, some of your lettuce plants can be ready to harvest in as little as a month. There are a few radishes that could be ready in as little as 3 weeks. Some of your cruciferous or your root vegetables are going to take a little bit longer. So you may be looking at like a 3 or 4 month growing period, or if you're planting, say, onions or garlic, you may have to plant them in the fall and harvest them in the spring. So there's not necessarily a correct answer as to which one you should do. I have done it both ways and I really don't have a preference. It just depends on what I'm growing, what I want to grow in the fall, and then what my garden looks like currently. So if my current garden is starting to look crazy and it's just not doing anything anymore, then I may go in and just take the stuff up that's not growing right and go ahead and replace it. So that's really up to you as far as how you actually put your fall garden into the ground. So the first step to planning your fall garden is you're going to want to check your frost dates. And the easiest way to do that is with the Old Farmer's Almanac website. And you can go to this link right here, almanac.com/gardening/frost dates #. And what you're going to do is when you go to this link, there is a box at the top of the page, and I'm going to show you what it looks like on the next slide. But you're going to plug in your zip code, and it's going to find either your frost date or the frost date to the city closest to you. This site doesn't have every individual city. It's usually just the larger cities. So you should be able to find one that's pretty close to you that will be generally the same as your actual frost date. So once you find your first frost date, which is the average annual frost date for your area. So what date in the fall can you expect to get your first frost? That's what we're trying to figure out. And it's going to give you an estimate, right? This is based off of like 100 years worth of data. So that doesn't mean it's going to be your exact frost date. It's going to give you an average. So to make sure that you don't plant too late, you want to go ahead and add 2 weeks to that frost date as a buffer. Okay, and let me give you an example to kind of make a little bit more sense. All right, so when you go to that link from the previous page, or you could just Google find average frost date, that link will pop up and you'll come to this box at the top of the page. So you will put your zip code or your city and state in this box and you just hit search. I am in Fort Worth in Texas, so I put Fort Worth in and it shows you the nearest climate station and then the average first fall frost. That's the one that we're interested in. We're not interested in the altitude or the last spring frost or the growing season. When we're planning a fall garden, the only thing that we're worried about is that first fall frost date. Now, for me, it says that my first average frost date is November 14th. Remember, this is an average. This is not your exact date. This does not predict anything. This just tells you on average, this is when you can expect to have a first fall frost. So what we're going to do when we're planning our fall garden is we're going to add 2 weeks to that. So we're going to bump that date up 2 weeks. So instead of me planning my first fall frost date to be on November 14th, I'm going to give myself a buffer and say that it's November the 1st. You're much less likely to get caught off guard by an early fall frost if you plan for your fall frost to be early, okay? So make sure that when you're planning, you give yourself a couple of weeks of a buffer. So I would try to have my stuff that needs to be harvested before the frost harvested before November 1st. And that's just gonna, like I said, give me a little bit of a buffer to make sure that I'm not caught off guard. And then once you've got your fall frost date figured out, you can actually start looking at plants. There are 3 main categories of types of plants that grow really well during the cool season or during the fall. So the first group is your root crops. This could be things like garlic, onions, carrots, turnips, radishes, beets. Those things all grow really well in the wintertime. Your cruciferous vegetables like your broccoli and your cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, those also do really well in the fall. And then your leafy greens, so spinach, lettuce, kale, Swiss chard, all of that stuff will grow really well. And most of those things can handle a light freeze or 2. Now, you do want to make sure when you are ordering seeds that you check and make sure if it's a variety that can handle a frost or if it's something that needs to be harvested before you do get a frost. The beans and peas that we've talked about, some of those legumes are less likely to handle a frost well, which is, it's a little unfortunate because they do amazing things for the soil. But if you plant those, you just want to make sure that you plan on having them harvested before that average frost date, right? And then oddly, some vegetables are actually better after they've been hit by a frost or 2. A prime example of that is a carrot. So while a carrot is actively growing, it's got, you know, the carrot underground and then the leafy green part above the ground. And the plant makes sugars in the leafy green part, which is above the ground. When that plant gets hit with a frost, it kind of shocks the plant a little bit, and the plant thinks, oh, I have to get ready for the top to die back because it's about to be too cold for the top to keep growing. So I'm going to send all of these sugars down into the root or the carrot where they can be stored until the spring when I can keep growing. So all of those sugars will rush down into the carrot, and it actually makes it taste a lot sweeter if you pick it after it's been hit by frost. Okay, so what should you be doing now? The first thing that I like to do is grab a calendar. I like to have something in front of me where I can actually see dates, write down some deadlines, write down my average frost date, and then, you know, your buffer frost date that you picked, which is 2 weeks before that. And then you can start working backwards. So on the back of your seed packet, you'll have information on how long it takes for your plants to grow. And you can use that to work backwards to see when you need to actually start your seeds inside. Most of your fall crops are going to be hard to find as a transplant, and it's a lot easier to start those seeds inside, and it's also a lot more cost efficient. A good example of this would be lettuce. So let's say you buy a 6-pack of lettuce at your local nursery and you pay $3 for it. That's 6 plants for $3, right? So you're paying about 50 cents per plant. Or you can buy a pack of seed, which has maybe 50 or 100 seeds for the same price. So it's a lot more cost efficient if you start seeds, especially for these cool season plants. And then my advice that I always feel like I'm having to give people is just start growing. Don't think that planting a fall garden has to be complicated, because it's really not. Okay, so your fall crops, as long as you're growing something that is a cool season crop, they can handle the cooler temperatures, and just get them in the ground and just start growing. So the worst thing that's going to happen is they're not going to grow right, or maybe you're not going to get the harvest that you wanted. But if you plan and work backwards and give yourself that 2-week buffer for your first average frost date, you should be fine. Just make sure that you're, like I said, you're growing cool season crops, and just get them in the ground, get those seeds started. Now is the time. If you're watching this, it's the time. So start planning that fall garden, go ahead and get it going. And then definitely make sure that you check out the park seed collections. They have so many seeds for growing a fall garden. You can definitely find stuff that's going to fit your growing season. So go check out what they have, grab your calendar, get your first average frost date, and start planning that fall garden. Okay. All right. I think now we're going to grab a couple of questions. So Eric, do we have some questions from the audience?
Yeah, thank you, Shelby. Just for those folks who are interested in seed collections from Park Seed, we do have actually a cool season veggies website or page on our website. Just go to veggies and you'll find it in the drop down. Just want to thank you, Shelby, for leading this presentation in this webinar. We do have a few questions that were submitted prior. So we're not going to, just for the audience, we're not going to be able to get to every question, but we will try to respond to all of them offline. Once again, if you don't hear from us, email us at info@parkseed.com. And if you have any future ideas for webinars or ideas that we should cover for future webinars, because we want to start doing this regularly, email us at info@parkseed.com. All right, Shelby, I got a question from somebody in Arizona. I live in Arizona and our summers are obviously very hot and dry. Anything that I can be starting now in terms of vegetables, or should I wait a bit?
So that's a really good question. And my advice for you is definitely check your first average frost date, like what we talked about. And I would kind of use that and work backwards and get yourself a good starting point to see when you need to start seeds, and see if it's early enough, or if it's if now is the right time. So that would be where I would start.
All right, thank you. We got another one, kind of off topic, but I know it's a common question we get within customer service. How do I get rid of Japanese beetles?
Oh, I hate Japanese beetles. So I feel your pain. I feel your pain on this one. Unfortunately, the Japanese beetle, which you may be aware of, it is an invasive species and it's pretty problematic because it does not have a true natural predator here in the United States like it does back in Japan. So oddly enough, in Japan, it's not a real nuisance like it is here, which seems crazy because if you have Japanese beetles, you know how big of a pain that they can be. So a lot of the insecticides that you may use to keep other pests off of your plants, unfortunately, are not all that great at controlling Japanese beetles. So you do have a few things that you can do though to help out. One of my favorite things to do is actually to plant what I call sacrificial plants. So Japanese beetles, they'll eat pretty much anything, but they're really attracted to plants that have blooms on them. So unfortunately, that means they like to get on a lot of your plants that you put in the vegetable garden or maybe in your flower bed. But you can plant things to use just to feed the Japanese beetles to keep them off of your quote unquote good plants. And a really good option for that is a marigold. They love to eat the blooms on marigolds for some reason. I know most pests tend to stay away from marigolds, but Japanese beetles are kind of the opposite. So you could plant Japanese beetles. You can buy Japanese beetle traps. I will give you a word of caution. When a Japanese beetle dies, it actually releases a pheromone that attracts other Japanese beetles. So you want to put your Japanese beetle trap like as far away from your garden as possible because once the beetles start getting in there and they die, it's going to attract more and you definitely don't want that close to your garden. And then my last recommendation would be to just pick them off by hand and drop them into a bucket of water and insecticidal soap. That tends to be one of the maybe unpleasant but more effective ways of dealing with them. So that's what I would do.
I did not know about the pheromone situation there. That's crazy.
Yeah.
All right. So you mentioned frost dates earlier. We got a question about where somebody could find information about their frost dates. And that's go to the Almanac website, following Shelby's advice there. I do have a follow-up on that one. What do you do if you have no frost dates? Somebody like living in Miami, for example, or the Keys.
So first of all, I would say that I am very jealous if you don't have to deal with a kind of a slump in the growing season. So you can, if you don't have a frost to worry about, I would just plan on keeping your summer garden growing as long as you can. And then once it gets to where it's kind of dying back, or maybe your plants aren't producing as much and the temperatures are a little bit cooler, you can definitely plant cool season crops. I actually have some friends that live in Central Florida and they definitely take advantage of that. They garden all year long. So just squeeze out what you can of your summer garden. And then once, like I said, once it dies back, go ahead and get your fall garden planted and just keep, growing it as long as you want to. If you can grow it all winter, that's awesome. So that's what I would do.
Right. And this is going to be our last question. Just want to thank you again, Shelby. The last question should be a fun one. What do you grow?
Everything that I possibly can. So, um, I'm, I think it may be easier to answer what I don't grow. And I'm trying to think of what that would be. We don't grow radishes just because I'm not like a big fan of radishes. But we grow, all the typical things, eggplants, peppers, tomatoes, all your summer vegetables pretty much, and cauliflower, cabbage, turnips, lettuce, herbs, everything in between. I will say that I tend to like stuff that looks a little bit different. So if it's an heirloom, I'm definitely growing it or trying to grow it. Or if it's something that's a funky color like purple carrots, we love to grow that, just because, it's a little bit harder to find that in a grocery store. So if we can grow it at home, why not?
All right, I tell you what, you grow the radishes and then you can just send them to me because I'll bake them.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you, Shelby, for leading our webinar today. Thank you for the great content, and hopefully great insights for all of our participants and viewers. And to those of you who registered and those of you who are viewing, thank you for coming on. Certainly send us ideas on what we could be covering in the future. We hope to do this more regularly. Again, just email us at info@parkseed.com. And if we didn't get to your question today, we do have it when you submitted that form at the registration. So we will be reaching out and responding. With that, I'm gonna let it come to a close. Thank you, Shelby.
Thank you.